Church. As many of you may recognize, I'm not David. He's gone to Honduras, and so I have the opportunity to fill in while he is gone. And so some of you may know who I am, some of you may not, but I am the youth intern. I'm working with Connor with the youth group, and so it's been a blessing being here so far. I'm from Pensacola, Florida, same state, different time zone. But I'm a student at Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama. I'll be going into my senior year as a youth and family ministry major. And so that kind of gives some insight to the title of today's sermon. I specialize kind of in youth ministry. I can give that to one of my professors that I just had an incredible class with. And we've talked a ton about youth ministry. I've done other internships, and they've had me read books, and these books give great statistics and great numbers about youth ministry. But before we begin getting too much into that, I want to begin with, how do I use this thing? Oh, I got to turn it on. That would make sense. There we go. Starting in John chapter 6. David actually did a lesson on feeding either the 4,000 or 5,000 recently. And so there's not too much more I can say about that, but there is something specific that I want to point out. And so let's read this, and then we'll get into that. It says, "After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with the disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?' He said this to them to test them, for they themselves knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, 'This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world.'" So what do I want to point out? I want to point out these two verses 8 and 9. It says, "One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?'" Is that as the disciples, as Andrew was searching for someone with food, something to feed these people, he came across a boy who probably had the faith to offer up his food, his 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But this boy knew that wasn't enough, but he knew that with Jesus, there would be enough for all the people there. Even Andrew doubted, but this boy had something to give. He had his lunch. A lunch that was meant for a small boy, but he had something to give. And so whenever I'm talking about this verse, is that this boy's lunch was able to feed 5,000 people, and that's just the men. Whenever we think about this spiritually, what can our youth do to feed souls around them? Is that our youth each have a potential. Our youth have a potential to feed so many souls, and are we putting time into them? Are we raising them up in the church? Are we doing the right things to teach them how to affect the souls around them? Is that our kids have potential. They have value. They are worth a ton. You couldn't put an amount on how much our youth are worth. The impact that they have on church is incredible. The fact that so many youth groups have their youth sit up front, and we see our youth every day. The fact that there's babies crying in the pews is amazing. It's that if there's no babies crying in the pews, the church isn't growing and it's dying. But church This church is growing. I've seen that working with the youth. I've seen that with the children's church program. This church is growing, and it's incredible. Another great example that I want to give is from 1 Samuel 16. What happened in 1 Samuel 16? Well, David was anointed king. Many of us know this story, but if you don't, I'll run through it. Samuel was given the job of anointing the king that would reign after Saul. And so Samuel went out to the house of Jesse where he was told to go. And he saw David's older brothers. Jesse even brought forth David's older brothers because they were more fit in the eyes of the people to be king. It's that they were older, they were more mature, they probably were more handsome, they probably were stronger at the time. But God didn't look at that. What God looked on was the heart. The heart of children is incredible. David was a boy. He didn't even bother showing up to the anointing, figuring that there's no chance that he becomes king. Maybe Jesse told him not to come because there's no chance that a boy his age could be worth so much in the eyes of God. But that's the exact opposite of what happened. David was anointed king, and we all knew this. But that doesn't. We shouldn't overlook our youth. It's that Jesse and his brothers overlooked David because of his youth. But there's no reason to overlook our youth for that. It's that they are going to grow into the next generation of ministers, into preachers, deacons, elders. They're currently members of this church. They're currently members of this body. So they're not the church of tomorrow. They are the church of today, but they will be the leaders of the church tomorrow. And so, with that being said, I want to walk down an example with you, and what better example than my own life? I was raised in the church. My dad grew up in the church, and my mom was baptized when my older brother was born. And so my entire life, I grew up in the church. I grew up going to church on Sundays and Wednesdays, and that's what I was taught to do. I don't remember now, I'd say probably about third grade, my church got a youth minister. And I just remember there being a very strange couple sitting up front that I'd never seen before. And growing up, I come to realize that this was my youth minister. And he had an incredible impact on my life. He's the reason why I'm in school at Faulkner. He's the reason why I'm able to stand up here and preach to you guys today. And so about middle school, I was baptized. And then over the next few years, eventually I would graduate high school. But there's a surprising statistic that I want to share, and that's that I should have left the church. 70% of kids between the ages of 18 and 22 leave the church. So I should not have been in church. And there's a statistic that helps me with this, is that I don't really know how else to explain it, but that statistic is crazy. It's still hard to wrap my mind around, and I've been studying it for the last few weeks. But 70% of kids aged between 18 and 22 leave the church. 3 out of 10 will stay in church. That's just crazy to me. And I shouldn't be here today. I stand against this statistic because of another statistic, a 5-to-1 ratio. Typically when we think of a 5-to-1 ratio, we think of like camp counselors. Is that there needs to be one adult for every 5-10 students at a camp, so we have enough eyes watching the kids to make sure they're not doing anything too crazy. But the books that I'm studying, Sticky Faith, and then there's a group that's called Think Orange. They use that 5-to-1 ratio in the opposite of how we typically think. 5 adults to 1 kid. That's 5 meaningful relationships for each 1 kid. It says that there are 5 people who know their hopes and dreams, 5 people who know their quirks and good points, 5 people who they can talk to honestly about what's really going on in their lives, 5 people who can offer wisdom when life gets confusing, and 5 people who care about them and pray for them. 5-to-1. Parents, grandparents, if you're not a parent, talk to these kids. Have a relationship with these kids. Have them over to your home. Have their families over to your home. Spend time with them. Because 70% of them statistically will leave the church. However, uh, there's so much that we can do to change that statistic from 70% to like 30% and even less. And it's incredible if we spend time with our youth. Is that the youth minister can't do it all. This 5-to-1 shows that. Is that if the youth minister is trying to take care of 30 kids, he's not going to be able to do that. Is that my relationship with my youth minister luckily was impactful enough on my life to change it. But I shouldn't have changed it. I didn't have any other relationships with people who deeply knew who I was, who really knew who I was, and I'm able to stand up here and say that I was lucky. And I wouldn't want anyone else to ever go through that. So adults have an impact on these kids. Reach out to them. In youth group, whether you're sitting up front or sitting back with your parents, don't ignore what I'm saying because I'm preaching to your parents or the adults around you. Let the adults impact your life. Don't just walk in and out of here, out the doors on Sundays and Wednesdays. Sit down, talk to some adults. Tell them about what's going on. Tell them these things. Let them know your interest. Some people want to invest in your life. I've seen so many adults come up here and talk to kids and spend time with them. There's some of youth group that's out of town this week. There's some of youth group that's out of town all summer, and I've seen those adults reach out and be like, hey, while you're gone, if you need anything, I'm here for you. It's incredible the work that you guys put into the youth group. And so, please, youth group, use the relationships, use the elders, use the deacons, use the adults around you to build your faith, because 90% of the 70% that leave the church didn't plan to do so. They had no intention of leaving the church, but they still did. And so if you build your relationships, you will build a better foundation for yourself as well. And so the church has about 40 hours of influence a year. Parents, you have 3,000 hours of influence a year. The difference is crazy. 40 hours of influence, that's less than an hour a week. You have less than an hour a week to influence these kids. Statistically, it's probably even less than that. Is that statistically kids are here half the time. So 40 hours is a little generous, but if it's 1 hour a week, that's 52 hours. That's still 12 more hours of influence. And so the church does not have that much influence, as much as we would love to have on these kids. So parents, this is your job. This is where the verse that I had for the Bible reading kind of comes into play. Deuteronomy 6 is raise your kids up in the ways of the church, and we'll get into that later. But parents, you have 3,000 hours of influence. But so many things take away from those hours that you have. It's that you have school, they have sports, their own entertainment, social media. They're sitting on these things all the time, and it's taken away from the hours of influence that you have. But think about it like this. You have the 5-to-1 ratio. Each kid has 5 adults that they are deeply connected to. They spend an hour with them, an hour with one of them a week. That adds an hour a week. They spend an hour with one of these adults that's connected with them a month. That's 12 more hours a year. They start spending more time with these adults, with the church. That's so many more hours that the church has and that parents have if they spend time with our brothers and sisters that are older, our brothers and sisters that are wiser, that are able to check in on them. So parents, make sure that church and spending time with the adults around you, other adults that are in the youth group, adults that don't have children in the youth group, get to know them. That's what I can say. I actually heard a quote the other day, and I heard it after I'd sent in my slide, or else I would have had it on my slides. But it says, what one generation finds optional, the next generation finds unnecessary. I'll say that again. What one generation finds optional, the next generation finds unnecessary. If you're not coming in here on Sundays and Wednesdays and making it a priority, your kids will decide that it's that it's optional. They don't need to go to church. A big change that happened in my life within the past 5 years. My family didn't go to church whenever we were on vacation. My dad he became an elder recently, but a few years ago we went to a new church, and I think it kind of switched the ideas of how they thought about things. And now whenever we go visit my grandparents, we go to church on Sundays. That's what we do. There was a church 15 minutes down the road. One of the elders at that church is the twin brother of one of my professors. I would have never had that relationship had my parents not decided to go to church on Sundays when we were out of town. And so because they put such a priority on it, I've put in such a priority on it. And so what one generation finds optional, the next generation finds unnecessary. If it's church, if there's no sporting events. Church, if NFL football is not on tonight. Church, if I wake up feeling good. Your kids will decide that church is unnecessary, and that's not what we want. But here's this verse that we read for for the Bible verse this morning. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as a frontlet between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates." There's another verse, I believe it's Deuteronomy chapter 8, that talks about wearing bracelets and things like that in memory of the Lord. This has these same ideas that do all these things to remember the Lord. Do all these things so when your kids get curious, you can answer those questions. Do all of these things so that your kids know that I am the Lord. That is what God is saying here in Deuteronomy 6. Is this whole chapter goes throughout this idea. If we don't bind them on our kids, if we don't teach our children to fear the Lord, to understand the Lord, to want to know the Lord, to study the Lord, to ask questions about God, then they will again find church optional. They won't find it necessary. It will be unnecessary to them. Another verse is Joshua, or actually, before I get into that, let me talk about Timothy some. Timothy is a great example. I think it's a go-to when discussing young people. And that's because of Timothy's relationship with Paul. Timothy had a relationship with Paul. He had relationships with other disciples, and those relationships had an impact on his life and the person that he became. But the relationships that we sometimes look over are relationships that he began with. The relationships of his mother and grandmother. He was raised underneath their watch. Is that Paul saw potential in him because the way they raised him, and the ideas and the knowledge and the influence that Timothy had came from his mother and grandmother. So parents, it's important to raise your kids up in a way that the Lord would see fit. But Joshua, this verse about Joshua 19 through 24, the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, "When your children ask their fathers in times to come, 'What do these stones mean?' then you shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up on the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever." This is actually, off the spur of the moment, I remembered one reason why I love this passage so much, and it is because of the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a back and forth between God and Habakkuk, as Habakkuk questions God about the things that he's doing. He wants the Israelites to be punished, and God's like, well, I'm going to do this. This is my way of punishing them. I'm going to destroy them, take them into captivity. Then Habakkuk's like, well, that's not what I meant when I said punish the Israelites. And then Habakkuk kind of has this conversation, and he comes to realize that God's in control, that God is the all-powerful, all-knowing, the judge, and he has the right to say. And so, but throughout that, he goes on and says, "You are the God of the waters. You are the God who turned the sea to blood. You are the God who parted the sea." Habakkuk knows that because of these stories. Habakkuk knows that because when he was a child and he asked these things, his family taught him. What stones are you setting up for your family? What stones are your kids asking you about? What stones are you giving to show your kids that there is something important for them in the church? That if you don't have stones set up, or if you have the wrong stones set up, they'll ask the wrong things, and it will be led down a misconstrued path. If you have stones set up about college football, what team do I root for? What team's my rival? That's what they grow up knowing. But if you have their stones set up to remind them of the Lord and to teach them of God, they will grow up saying, who is Jesus? Why did he die for my sins? How do I love like Jesus? How do I forgive like God? That's the questions we want our kids asking. And church, I think it's part of my contract today to ask you this, it's not really a question, but isn't it grand to be a Christian? And isn't it grand to be at Concord? I know I'm not the face that you usually see up here on Sunday, but I figured I had to get that out. And so, thank you for the opportunity to preach this morning. It's been a blessing to put this lesson together. And so I really, really want you guys, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're not a parent, but you know any of these kids, have an impact on their lives. Kids, let the adults teach you so much. Brent, thank you for the amazing class you taught today for the middle school class. You're having an impact on these kids' life. Get to know them. Spend time with them outside of Sundays and Wednesdays. Have them over to your house. If you're struggling today with anything, the church, we want you to know that we love you. If you need anything today, you can come forward to the front pews as we sing our invitation song, and just know that one of the elders will meet you up front.